Rackliffe House has a long history that represents a microcosm of 18th century Chesapeake society. Let's look back at some of the wonderful stories Rackliffe House would recognize if its walls could see, hear, and talk. The walls might tell of marauding Spanish galleons, of Barbary pirate ships, English men of war, or even of German submarines along the coast, all within clear view of Rackliffe House. They might tell of great wars through which this country has lived: the French and Indian Wars, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, and more recently, the wars of the 20th century. The walls might have sorrowed at families split by political allegiances, both in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. They might look back at the immigrant, Charles Rackliffe, the great-grandfather of the builder of Rackliffe House. That Charles Rackliffe had crossed the Atlantic to Virginia's eastern shore in August of 1650 and was soon followed by his wife Bridget and their infant son, Charles Jr. The walls might have mourned the immigrant Charles's unexpected death in 1665, just 15 years after his arrival in Virginia. The walls would also talk about the growth of the family lands to 6,100 acres by his son Charles Jr. That Charles, moving north from Virginia to Maryland's seaside, along with his brother-in-law Edward Whaley, took over the 2,200-acre tracts known as Geneser and Goshen. At his death in 1696, Charles Jr. was one of the wealthiest seaside residents, leaving an estate valued at 332 pounds sterling to his widow Elizabeth and their 3 children. The walls would talk of Rackliffe's interactions with the Assateague Indians, who had occupied the land long before the arrival of the Rackliffe family. Certainly, the walls would have rejoiced about the New World Order that was developing on the Eastern Shore. Kinship often determined settlement patterns and thus interrelationships among families. An ever-expanding kinship network would make its mark on Delmarva for years to come, as a few families would, by and large, dominate the economic, social, and political development of the lower shore. This country gentry tried to replicate the lifestyle which they had left in England, the only difference being that here there had been an amazing social mobility during the first generation of settlement, a mobility not possible in England. The Rackliffes, ensconced on Sennapuxent Neck, not only rubbed elbows but also intermarried with prominent local families. With the resulting marriages and multiple remarriages, Charles Rackliffe V, who built Rackliffe House in about 1740, had at least 96 close relatives, all of whom would have known Rackliffe House. In addition to involvement in seaside trade, Charles Rackliffe harvested local timber for shingles and cypress boards, grew tobacco, corn, and wheat, raised livestock, and sold leather goods. The walls would have witnessed the lives and deaths of enslaved Africans who labored in the fields and at various industries on the Rackliffe plantation. 17 slaves are listed by such names as Robin, Daniel, Esther, and Doll in the plantation inventory following Charles Rackliffe's death in 1752. The estate was valued at 1,166 pounds sterling and was left to his son John. In John's generation, the halls would have buzzed with discussion of crop failures and successes, politics, religion, and economic life. John, like his father, was heavily involved in salt production and was a prominent merchant planter, his ships bringing back from England costly fabrics, porcelain, mirrors, and other British goods desired by neighboring planters. John Rackliffe, who had inherited the vast tract of land upon which Rackliffe House stood, died in 1790, leaving an estate of 4,247 pounds sterling and passing the land on to his son, also named John. The walls would also talk of tragedy, of the death of John Rackliffe II in 1800 and the death of his widow, Sarah, shortly thereafter. Their 4 underage orphans might tearfully have looked back at the locked doors of Rackliffe House as they moved west to Princess Anne, Maryland, to live with their uncle, William Winder, nephew of Maryland Governor Levin Winder. The walls would have sorrowed by 1820 at the deaths of both John and Ryder Rackliffe, the last male descendants who died young and single in Princess Anne, Maryland, leaving 2 sisters, Charlotte, and Keturah, who moved to Annapolis, Maryland. By the mid-19th century, the Rackliffe surname had become extinct in Worcester County. Denuded of its vibrant history, the house took on a shadowy existence. Stories of ghosts, specters, objects levitating in the house, and paranormal happenings gave the house an even more ominous and eerie existence.
One particular night at a dinner party in this dining room, Gene Parker and several friends were all sitting around the table, and Gene was listening to the ghost stories, and he said, "I don't believe in ghosts." My mother always had candles on the table. And just as he said that, the candles flared up and all the lights in the house went out.
The house passed through many different hands, the Fassets, Derricksons, and Woodcocks. By the beginning of the 21st century, the once impressive two-story Rackliffe house had lost almost all semblance of its original 18th century structure. Its rose-colored Flemish bond brickwork had been obscured by layers of stucco and paint. A disastrous fire in 1928 had disfigured its interiors almost beyond recognition. Partitions divided once stately rooms. Even the steeply pitched roof with its kicked eaves had been modified to a gently sloping hip roof, inappropriate to the style of the impressive Georgian structure. Had he been recalled to life, Captain Charles Rackliffe, the builder of Rackliffe House, would have been hard-pressed to recognize his own home. Although the original plantation had many outbuildings, only one survived, a brick milkhouse. The walls would tell of the lives of the many tenant families who resided in Rackliffe House until the latter years of the 20th century.
My name is Janet Nichols. I lived in this home with my mother and father and grandmother. We moved here in 1947. My father was a farm manager for Delaney Foods. When I lived here, I was of course very aware that this was an older home. But as far as being visited by any ghost, there was no such thing.
Finally, the walls would tell of Tom Patton and of the vision he shared with a handful of other folks. A house that has not only been preserved, but has been restored to its 18th century appearance to allow the walls to continue relating their story as the house lives again as the center of Worcester County life.
You know, it's a history filled with legends, some of them perhaps true, some of them have not been confirmed or have been proved false. There's murder, there's intrigue, there's competition between ownerships of the properties here, and this is the story that we want to, put forward in some sort of a chronological order, but there are stories within the stories that will take us a little more time.
And now, as you ponder the many facets of Rackliffe House and its owners, it's time to tour Rackliffe House and learn more about what life was like along Maryland's seaside in the 18th century.